Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 25 series. Can we save the 2038 World Series champion Oakland A's? So clearly things went very well in the 2038 season. We won a championship for the second time in the last 3 seasons. Won the AL West, had the best record in baseball, and then when all was said and done, did finish up as world champions, as I noted. Split the first 2 games in Oakland against the Yankees, so they had taken home field advantage from us before we went to New York, but we won 2 straight in the Bronx to clinch that series. The LCS against the Rays, we felt like we were in great control. We took the first 2 games in Oakland, flew across the country to Tampa, where we won the 3rd game of the series, and then Tampa won the final 2 games in Tampa Bay. Flew back across the country, and they won game number 6 in Oakland. So we were facing the desperate situation of trying to avoid a 3-0 lead, ending up with a 4-3 series loss, and fortunately did win game 7 of the ALCS, which pushed us into the World Series. We were facing the defending World Series champion San Diego Padres. We won in 2036. The Padres won in 2037. So this was a matchup of the previous 2 World Series winners, even though we had not faced each other in either series. And we jumped out to another 2-0 lead at home and actually took game 3 in San Diego, so a very similar situation to the start of the Tampa Bay ALCS. Jumped out to a 3-0 lead. The Padres won game number 4, but fortunately we routed them in game number 5 to win the World Series championship. So that means we are at the start of the offseason, and before we start moving along too far, honestly, before we start moving anywhere at all in this offseason, we are going to do our annual roster review, check in on the players that helped us to this championship this year, and start figuring out who we may be bringing back and who we may potentially be moving on from. And I honestly don't know what the heck is going on here in our inbox. Those of you who saw us at the end of the last episode, we had the option year decisions that we are facing this year, and now all of a sudden it's like bringing me back to option year decisions from about a year ago. And it's got the 2036, our sweep of Oakland listed here is just coming out. So clearly something corrupted in our inbox. So I'm not pleased to see that. When I do look at our salary page, it looks like the right things are going on. So I wanted to start the episode by just talking through the 3 option decisions that we did have, and we exercised Jake Ortega's $8 million team option for next season. We declined Mike Curtis's $5 million option, and he's still technically arbitration eligible after we declined that option for a little less money. But given that he's going to miss all of next year with that torn flexor tendon in his elbow, we will clearly not be offering him anything in arbitration. Jeremy Scholl was our final team option that we have to figure out over the next couple of weeks. Still deciding what to do there, and that'll be one of the things that we're probably talking through with our loyal viewers as we prepare for the beginning of this 2038 to 2039 offseason. So as we get ready to recap the season, look at how we've gotten to where we are today, 5 straight losing seasons to get things started with Oakland, as we had a slower start than we had hoped in terms of building up the organization and building some credibility with ownership and building the type of program that we ultimately wanted to have. But over the last decade, we've been pretty successful over these last 10 seasons, 9 winning seasons, 8 playoff appearances, and as I noted, now 3 World Series championships. And I really like where our roster is, and I really like where our farm system is right now. So cautiously optimistic that we can continue to be one of the top teams in baseball after we finally topped the 100-win plateau for the first time here in 2038. Team statistics that got us here, a really successful season, never had a losing month, and our 3 highest winning percentages per month of the season were in August, September, and October. October admittedly being a very small sample size of just 3 regular season games, but we certainly were playing our best baseball of the year as we clinched the AL West and ultimately clinched the American League, and then when all was said and done, clinched the World Championship. Very well-balanced team, 3rd in the American League in runs scored, and we were top 6 in every offensive category. Good on the base paths as well, 4th in steals and 2nd in base running. Similarly, a good defensive team, 4th in defensive efficiency and 2nd in zone rating. And the pitching staff was brilliant. The 606 runs that we allowed were the fewest we've ever allowed in the 15 years playing here in Oakland. And you can see we were 1st, 2nd, 3rd, or 4th in every significant pitching category in the American League in this 2038 season. And as we talked about, our pitching staff was a really significant contributor to what we were able to end up accomplishing with the A's this season. And that really started with our outstanding starting rotation. Still have the 4-man rotation we used through the playoffs set up. Jesus Saldana, who we signed to a long-term contract before he had done much of anything in the major leagues, followed up his brilliant rookie season when he led the AL in ERA with a 16-7 record, tied for the league lead with 34 games started, 3.38 ERA and a 4.6 WAR. Certainly expecting the young right-hander to be an important part of our rotation for many years to come. Chase Dora, we've got at this point 2 years left with him. We picked him up in that big trade a season and a half ago with the Cincinnati organization, traded them a big-time player and some others, but they were willing to keep a big chunk of his contract, which helped us a lot. He was not great in the playoffs this year, but he tied for the American League lead with 18 wins, 18-3 record, almost 200 strikeouts, and an AL best 2.61 ERA. Mr. Dora will certainly be back with us next year, probably as our number 2 starter in the rotation, right behind Mr. Saldana. And we'll likely be returning our number 3 starter as well, the youngster Doug Weiss. Moved him from the stopper role, where he was incredible in 2037, to a starter role this year, and all he did was go 14-6 with a 3.80 ERA and a WAR of over 4. Would love to get the young pitcher signed to a long-term deal, but he is still looking for really big money, unfortunately for us. And I've been kind of pausing here because I'm a little concerned there's something seriously wrong with this file, because you'll note that there's not an option for me to talk contract with Mr. Weiss here. And we've got the ability to go this way and negotiate. Okay, all right. So I already offer. Okay, I wanted to. All right, I think I'm freaking myself out here because that whatever just happened with the mail here, has me really concerned because that sweep of the World Series was 2 years ago, and Jamie DeVore and Jason Caro option year decisions were, I believe, needed last season. So I'm thinking things are incredibly corrupted in this file. What I wanted to show was that Doug Weiss was looking for crazy numbers as far as a long-term extension with us. I know that's been something some of you have been suggesting and wanting me to monitor over the years, but I had forgotten that offline after I looked and saw that he was still looking for crazy money. I just went ahead and made him his arbitration eligible offer. So a little less concerned that there's something massively messed up in terms of the file, although now that I think about this, yesterday in real time after I won the World Series with the team, I did try to back things up. I can't claim that I do that every time that I play the game, but I usually try to back up things since we are playing this series, and for some reason the backup failed when I tried to do that yesterday. So after I finish this episode, I'm going to try that again. I hope that there's nothing too screwed up with this file, because finally just starting to have some fun and finally just starting to have some consistent success with this team. And we've also got a lot of interesting storylines to be following with some of the players we've traded for, some of the guys that have come up through our organization. So definitely don't want anything to get corrupted. But with Saldana, Dora, and Weiss likely back as our top three starters next year, going to be feeling pretty good about our rotation. The big question is what happens with Jackson Ferris, highest paid player on our team, made $24 million this year, 15-7 record, 3.57 ERA, and a 3.5 WAR. Really was a vintage Jackson Ferris season. We signed him to a 5-year, $110 million deal. He's a guy who has now been with us for a full decade. And honestly, Ferris, if we're done with him after a decade, it's been an incredible decade. As I mentioned, we've been to the playoffs 8 times in the last 10 years, winning seasons 9 times in the last 10 years after no winning seasons the first 5 years of this playthrough. And the trade we made to bring Jackson Ferris on board right before the 2029 season has proven to be a huge one for our organization. Ferris is the only player who has been with us on all three of our World Series championship teams. And despite his fragility through a pitch count the whole time that he's been with us, as well as a quick tiredness hook, he's never pitched fewer than 31 games in a season for us, led the AL in games started, or more accurately tied for the AL lead, or led the AL in games started 3 times. Also led the league in BABIP once in strikeouts per 9 innings. An incredibly consistent 10-year run with us in Oakland. Won double-digit games every year. Never had a losing season. And given that he's been with us exactly 10 years, pretty easy to figure out what an average year was for him. Started 33 games, went 13-8 with 181 innings pitched, 208 strikeouts, 3.58 ERA, and about a 3.5 WAR was his average season with us. He, at this point, is looking for 6 years at $18 million a year. Given that he's almost 35 years old, and given that we feel like we've gotten a bit lucky to have kept him so healthy, despite him having been fragile his whole career in Oakland, we're probably inclined to let him hit free agency. The big decision we've got ahead of us is, do we submit a qualifying offer to him? Right now, I'm leaning towards doing it. I don't think we need him back next year. But if he's looking for 6 years at $18 million a year, I think it's conceivable that at his age, especially with his fragility, 1 year at $18.9 million isn't going to be incredibly attractive to him. Even if he opts in, I think it's a tradable contract for us, given that he's still healthy at this point and coming off of another solid season. But as we'll talk about shortly, we've got enough young pitchers coming up through the organization that I feel probably don't need to push too hard to keep Ferris on board. Chuck Huntley had an outstanding year for us as our closer. 83 strikeouts and 59 and 2/3 innings, allowed just 2 home runs all year long, 36 saves, and a pretty impressive 30-5 ratio between shutdowns and meltdowns, 121 ERA, a ridiculous 352 ERA plus, almost as ridiculous 47 FIP minus, and a 2.8 WAR for him. The left-handed closer will be back next year. He is a guy who, for a closer, is kind of looking for pretty significant money. You can see about $100 million over 8 years, given that he's only been in the majors for 2 years, so he's going to be making the major league minimum next year before he gets into arbitration. Probably just going to continue to let him play out the contract that he's playing under right now, or more accurately, the terms and conditions that he's playing under right now. Mike Orozco picked him up in a trade with the Angels just over a year ago, and all Orozco did for us is a great job in that stopper role that allowed us to put Weiss into the rotation and never look back. Led the American League with 80 games despite some injury issues, 134 and 2/3 innings pitched out of the bullpen with 162 strikeouts, 3.41 ERA. That definitely crept up over the second half of the season as we used him pretty aggressively, 2.5 WAR on the year. He is a very popular player, and he's set to hit free agency. If you were looking closely, you'll see that we've made an offer to him. Hopefully we'll be able to talk about the terms and conditions of that offer when he accepts it in the not too distant future. But for those of you who are wondering, it's $39 million over 5 years, but honestly, it's really more of a 3-year contract, and then there's a team option for year 4, but a player option that he really wanted for year 5. The first 3 years are lower money. Hoping to bring him back. Certainly expensive for a team with our budget to have a guy in the bullpen averaging close to $8 million a year. But Orozco was so good and is such a high volume pitcher for us out of the bullpen, and also we'll probably get a little bump to fan interest by signing the very popular guy to an extension. Figured it made sense to keep him around. Daniel Blanco, another reliever who's come up through our organization, 9th round pick in 2032, solidified a real important role in our bullpen this year. 2.65 ERA over 88 1/3 innings pitched. League best 30 holds for us in a setup role. Kamani O'Banner, who spent a good chunk of the year as our number 5 starter after a couple others flamed out in that role, ended up spending half the season basically as our 5th starter. Ended up back in the bullpen, but a 9-5 record with 7 holds. And it's conceivable, although he was in the bullpen for the playoffs when we went to the 4-man rotation, that he could be competing with some of the younger players to be back in the rotation next year, which is why, although his arbitration number is expected to be close to $8 million, likely looking to bring Mr. O'Banner back after a pretty solid season for us. He's also another guy who's very popular, so we're still trying to turn this team around financially and with the fans in signing some popular players like Orozco and O'Banner to extensions or even just arbitration. Years can't hurt. Left-hander Bobby Garland only started 6 games for us this year. He had been our 5th starter most of the 2 previous seasons. Both situations came in and took the job over after others flamed out. We tried that with him again this year, and he was actually pretty bad in the rotation. So after 6 games started, we moved to O'Banner. 4-7 record with a 4.36 ERA for Garland. He's arbitration eligible this year for the second time. One of the few left-handed arms that we have in the bullpen. Honestly, at this point, only Huntley and Garland are really likely to be back with us, as we're probably going to be moving on from Ferris unless he opts into that qualifying offer, and we could be moving on from R.J. Cope as well. So felt it was important to bring back Mr. Garland, which we intend to do. Jonathan Shearer, reliever, split the year between AAA and the majors for a second consecutive season. 4.58 ERA over 17 2/3 innings. Still really like the profile of the right-handed reliever. Great fastball and a pretty darn good slider. Really good stuff with above-average movement and control. And think that although he was somehow below replacement level this year with those traits, he still could be a guy who's better than that going forward. Jeremy Scholl, as I mentioned, is the last team option we need to think about. 2.90 ERA in just over 40 innings pitched this year. Half a win above replacement. Set to make $4 million next year if we exercise that team option. Going to have to think about the pitching staff holistically. We know we're losing Ferris, most likely. Probably going to be losing R.J. Cope, who we'll talk about right now. So there are definitely spots available in the rotation that Scholl could fill. The question is whether at $4 million we should fill it with him or somebody else. Left-hander R.J. Cope, a third-round pick of ours over a decade ago, really had a rough year for us as a left-handed specialist out of the bullpen, an ERA of close to 7 over 49 innings pitched. Struck out 56 batters in those 49 innings, which is pretty good, but he allowed 9 home runs, so 1.7 homers per 9 innings, which is pretty bad. And you can see he was below replacement level. The left-hander looking for $3.8 million over 3 years. Given that he's now on the wrong side of not just 30, but the wrong side of 31. His control has always been a little disappointing, and he's coming off of a really rough season. I don't know that we want to be spending $3.5–4 million a year on him. Cope is also an occasional two-way player for us, 0 for 5 this year with 2 strikeouts in the very limited opportunities he got at the plate. And the last 2 pitchers we'll talk about are guys who were September call-ups, guys who are young talent in this organization that we think could potentially join the rotation and almost certainly join the bullpen next season. Part of the reason why we're willing to consider moving on from Ferris and thinking that O'Banner could end up back in the bullpen. Right-handed pitcher Dave Baumler, 6th-round pick in 2033. Split most of the year between AA and AAA, where he was a combined 12-6, and then he pitched 4 games, 6 1/3 innings in September with Oakland. 1.42 ERA over those 6 1/3 innings. The only run he gave up was a solo home run. So did a pretty solid job there, and certainly looks like a guy who could be a back of the rotation type starter. Certainly could be a right-handed arm out of the bullpen. Does have that sidearm profile that I know some of our viewers don't appreciate, but we will certainly have him in the mix for a spot on the team next year, possibly in the rotation. And then left-hander Mike Blumenshine, 1st-round pick from a couple years ago out of Brown. Also spent most of the year in AA and AAA, where he was a combined 8-3. Did come up to Oakland. He pitched 5 games for us, including 1 start, 0.67 ERA over 13 1/3 innings. It's a very small sample size at the major league level, and after he had an ERA of over 5 in AAA, perhaps we should be a little bit cautious. But we like his 6-pitch arsenal. We like his stamina. We like his ability to hold on runners. Think his stuff, movement, and control could all be above average. Don't love the extreme fly ball tendencies, don't love his fragility. But Blumenshine, although he does have high financial ambition, has been a lot more reasonable in his contract demands than Doug Weiss has been. Similar profiles, honestly, between these two. Blumenshine, a little more stamina. They're both fragile, though. They're both in their mid-20s at this point, although Blumenshine is younger. Blumenshine with a more expansive pitch arsenal, but Weiss's pitches are probably higher end. And we've made an offer to Blumenshine. I can't remember whether we scrolled through it when I was looking at the other offer that we had made to Mr. Orozco, and obviously we didn't get down to Blumenshine, but $55 million over 9 years. You look at the ERA of over 5 that he put up in AAA, and that might be a little risky. But you look up at the sub-1 ERA that he did in 13 1/3 innings in the majors, and you look at his ratings and his potential ratings, and I think that could be a really good contract for us. And if we do get Blumenshine signed to that deal, we would presumably put him right into the rotation where we've run with the one lefty, Jackson Ferris, for good chunks of the last decade. Blumenshine could potentially give us a lefty to replace Ferris in the rotation if all works out well. So as we think about this pitching staff for next year, really like how it's positioned. You can see with the exception of Ferris, who won't be back unless he opts in to the qualifying offer, and Cope, who we're probably not bringing back. Dora is the only guy who might be on the team next year who's 30 or older right now. So a relatively young and pretty talented staff, and love having guys like Blumenshine and Baumler who can potentially slot right into the back end of the rotation behind the likes of Saldana, Dora, and Weiss. If we do end up with Blumenshine and Baumler as our 4th and 5th starters next year, that means that the back end of the bullpen in the late innings is Huntley, Orozco, Blanco, and O'Banner, which is a pretty effective and intimidating crew, and still could certainly have guys like Garland, Scherer, Scholl, and I guess potentially Cope mixed in. So don't feel like there's going to be a ton for us to do with the pitching staff this offseason. To me, the biggest maneuvering might happen if Ferris did opt into the QO. We probably would still look to trade him away, given that I'm inclined to give Baumler and Blumenshine some playing time. I guess in theory we could keep Baumler in the pen and have Ferris and Blumenshine be our 4th and 5th starters. Would be an incredible rotation, but I just don't feel at this point that we need to be spending $19 million on Ferris. That being said, if he really can get a 6-year deal for over $100 million, we'll be getting a first-round compensatory selection for him when he signs with somewhere else, so I certainly don't want to risk losing out on that. And I was ready to move on to our position players before I remembered that it wasn't all perfect with our pitching staff. Forgot to mention Fish Patterson, who we made a trade for with Miami 3.5 years ago that really hasn't worked out the way that we had hoped. Patterson has gone in his time with Oakland from being pretty good pitcher the first half season that we had him to a solid back of the rotation guy his second year with us, a very borderline back of the rotation guy his third year with us, and an absolutely disastrous back of the rotation guy this year in his 4th season with Oakland. Started just 9 games before we yanked him from the rotation. Originally put Garland in that 5 role as we talked about, and then O'Banner took it over and finally locked it down. But Patterson was 2-6 this year with a 6.48 ERA, more than a win below replacement. We thought we had signed him to a pretty decent 7-year, $43 million deal when we initially signed him. Some of those contracts have worked out well with us. We already talked about in this episode the one that we have offered to Orozco, and he's certainly a more proven player, as well as the deal that we offered to Blumenshine. But they don't always work out, and with Patterson set to make $6 and $7 million the next 3 years before the team option finally kicks in, probably a guy that we're going to look to move on from this offseason. Average stuff, average movement, below average control at this point. And hasn't been good for a good season and a half at this point for us. Going to be turning 30 next year. The issue with Fish Patterson is that he's got no trade value whatsoever. I shopped him, and there's not a single player in baseball who will be offered for him in a deal. They won't even offer us bad contracts for him. So we're probably going to have to attach a pretty good player to him to get little value in return. Kind of is what it is. I think the aggressiveness we've had over the years in terms of trying to sign players to early contracts, and in the case of Patterson, he was already a reasonably well-proven major leaguer when we signed him to the extension. But we've tried to project forward what guys could be and what we think they could become, oftentimes admittedly in a best-case scenario. And in the case of Patterson, he's definitely regressed to what he was a few years ago when we were signing him. You can see back in 2035, 2034, thought this was a guy who could end up well above average stuff with average movement, average control, throwing in the mid-90s. As we sit here today, the stuff is average, the movement is average, the control is below average. He's lost a mile in his velocity. And I'm going to be inclined to try to pay up to get out of that contract at some point in the early stages of this offseason. So we'll turn now to our everyday players from our really good offense, and I don't think we've got a ton of decisions to make here, too. As I think about the team and who our starters are, I don't see a lot of things changing for next season. I think we could have some pretty significant turnover among some of our backup players, though. So I'll let you know what I'm thinking, and I'm sure that some of you are always willing to let me know what you're thinking as we talk through who did well this year and what the roster might look like next year. Jaden Boakai started out the year as our starter at catcher, ended up a backup after we made a big trade. The 30-year-old is finally headed to free agency. He's looking for 6 years at $7.5 million a year. He was solid for us this year with a 91 WRC plus and a 1.4 WAR in 87 games played. But he is clearly our backup now with Mr. Mendoza on board. And as excellent as his defense is, I think a team with the budget of the Oakland A's and the second lowest budget in all of baseball is going to be hard-pressed to spend $6-7 million a year on a backup catcher. So inclined to think we need to let Boakai move on. Jorge Mendoza, love the way that the left-handed hitter's bat looks on paper, and he's a solid defensive catcher. He was only an average offensive player for us in the 146 at-bats after we picked him up in that trade with Minnesota, but still was a win above replacement in 45 games. And honestly, when we look at his fielding stats, his catcher ERA of 3.19 with Oakland this year was even better than what Boakai did. So he was solid defensively for us. He's headed into his first arbitration eligible season. He's extremely popular, so we'll love to sign him to at least a 1-year extension. He is looking for crazy money for a long-term extension, so he may end up being someone that we just need to play out the arbitration years with over the next 3 seasons before eventually giving him a QO and wishing him the best of luck. But certainly expect that Mendoza will be back as our everyday catcher next year. Another guy that we traded for this season, Jake Bauers, will be back as our everyday first baseman next year. Combined for 32 homers and 117 ribbies between the Red Sox and the A's, 142 WRC plus and a 1.8 WAR for us in 57 games. Gives us that captain personality that we always like to have in the locker room. So he should be back as our first baseman next year. And Juan Ramos heading into his final arbitration eligible season, another guy who's extremely popular, so looking to get a little bit of a boost when we hopefully sign him for a final year in Oakland. He has been an absolute monster since we picked him up in a trade with Seattle 3.5 years ago. The 24 homers and the 112 ribbies this year were by far the lowest figures that he's put up for us. That says a lot about how productive he's been offensively for us. Still led the American League with 119 walks. You'll remember we got a great result from Ramos in the development lab last offseason and put up a 133 WRC plus. He is one of only a couple left-handed hitters that we're sure we're going to have back next year. Honestly, Ramos and the catcher Mendoza are the only left-handed hitters that we're sure are going to be on the team next year. So we will certainly be looking to have Ramos back as our cleanup hitter and our DH in 2039. Yet another starting position that we think we have locked down for next year is second base, where the youngster Amari Alcindor ended up coming up midway through the season. Honestly, right about the time we were making those trades for Mendoza and Bauers. He put up a 112 WRC plus for us with 11 homers and 275 at-bats. Solid defensive middle infielder with a potentially pretty interesting bat. And certainly anticipate that Alcindor will be our second baseman next year. Expect that Andy Toribio will be back at third base. Offensively, he has regressed a bit from the early stages of his career. Only 14 home runs this year, although he still did drive in 87. Batting average fell all the way to 227, and the WRC plus fell to 79. But he was still a 2-WAR player thanks to his good solid glove, and he is signed to a very reasonable contract, which could have him making $3 million for the next 1 to 3 seasons, depending on whether or not we want to extend him or not. So a very solid and cost-effective option, but admittedly, those first couple years in the majors when he put up a 115 WRC plus and a 116 WRC plus, we thought we may have really found a true diamond in the rough offensively. But the last 3 years, Toribio still respectable, but not as big a star as we thought he might end up being. And then last but not least, among the starting players to talk about, Alejandro Landin, who pivoted from second base to third base when we brought up Mr. Alcindor, had another monster offensive season, led the American League with 188 hits, scored 101 runs, 31 homers, 97 ribbies, 306 batting average and a 137 WRC plus, put up a 5.8 WAR. A very versatile and solid defensive player who's got a really good bat. This IAFA signing from 2027 has worked out really well for us, and he is still signed to a very reasonable deal for the next 2 to 4 seasons. Interestingly, he wasn't all that great at third base. slightly below average in terms of his zone rating, just slightly above average in terms of his defensive efficiency. He made 6 errors in just 63 starts at the position. Looking at his profile, it looks like he should be a darn good third baseman. 65 range and a 70 arm is, probably a third baseman who's borderline gold glove quality depending on the season. But haven't seen that from him yet. Maybe next year when he plays the position throughout spring training, he'll be even more comfortable in that role. But with Mendoza at catcher, Bowers at first, Alcindor at second, Landine at third, Toribio at short, and Ramos at DH. Not feeling like there's going to be too many changes to our starting lineup in those positions next year. As we noted, though, the backups are where there could be some work for us to do. Hard to justify Boakai at $6 or $7 million as a backup catcher. Steve Allison, love his influence in the clubhouse, love a solid glove with a lot of versatility. But he only had 88 at-bats this year, put up an 86 WRC plus for us. He's finally getting into his arbitration-eligible years, set to make a little less than $2 million next year. Certainly is a useful utility infielder. Big question is whether we have someone in the organization making the major league minimum that we would rather have in that role. Alden McFadden, former second-round pick, finally made his major league debut in September, where he went 0 for 7 before we sent him back down to AAA. He is now out of options at this point as far as next season. Tend to think he will not be back with us. Like Allison's glove better, and not in love with either of their bats. Another guy in the mix, Rodney Mesidor, who actually had a pretty productive season for us offensively, set to make about $3 million next year in his second arbitration season. Only 133 at-bats this year. He was playing third base for us against left-handed pitching until we made the trade the trades to bring Mendoza and Bowers on board, and then also promoted Alcindor and flipped Mr. Landine to be our everyday third baseman, at which point Mesidor became more of a utility infielder for us, but put up a 125 WRC plus in those 133 at-bats. Doesn't have the range of a guy like Allison, but still a versatile defensive player with a better bat than Allison. My hunch is that McFadden is not the answer, but maybe we bring Allison or Mesidor back as one of our utility infielders, and then perhaps promote someone else from the organization to be a second utility infielder for us. Anilfo Dolan, who started out the year as our starting third baseman and ended up getting sent down to AAA. Another guy who could be in the mix for a utility infielder spot next year as well. Turning to our outfielders, Mike Alanis made a big trade with the Cubs last offseason to bring him on board, and honestly, he was disappointing. He was a league average offensive player for us, 233 average, 18 homers, 71 ribbies. Looking at what he did over his Cubs career with 70 home runs and 248 ribbies in 350 games started, and a 131 WRC plus over 2.5 years at Wrigley playing with the Cubs. Certainly we're expecting for more offensively than Alanis that we got. He's arbitration eligible this offseason. I think he's likely back as our starting left fielder next year. Probably give him another shot. Hope that the second season in Oakland goes a little better than the first. Danny Phelps is a guy who could certainly press him, though. The left-handed hitting outfielder who we picked up in a trade with Boston about 1.5 years ago. Real productive in AAA, and he was an average offensive player in 61 at-bats in the majors this year. When Alanis got hit before the World Series, Phelps took over as our left fielder against right-handed pitching, and he had some big games for us in the playoffs. So another guy that we like a lot. He's certainly cheaper than Alanis, so he could be competing with him for a left field spot next year. Another guy in the mix, Sam Gentile, picked him up a little less than a year ago. Had a big year for us in AAA. Only 5 for 39 in the majors in September. But the bat looks certainly respectable. A lot of speed, solid defensively, and he's got that personality class. He could certainly be in the mix to be a 4th or 5th outfielder for us next year. Sergio Palomares was our 4th outfielder most of this year, although we did play him in center field against left-handed pitching pretty regularly to ease the burden on Jake Ortega a bit as far as manning center field every day. Palomares, another solid offensive season, a 112 WRC plus in just under 300 at-bats. Never going to hit for much power, but he did have 28 doubles in just 288 at-bats, 17 of 18 on the base paths, 2.3 WAR. Love the speed, like the glove, and the bat is certainly more than respectable, just not a lot of home run power. So he should be back in the mix next year as a utility outfielder for us. The starting right fielder will almost certainly be Arturo Uresti. The batting average dropped to 242 this year, but he did have 28 homers, 88 ribbies, and a 114 WRC plus. The 2.7 WAR was a little below his first full year in the majors last year, but we like his durability. He's a solid glove, draws a good amount of walks, and he hits some home runs, and we have him signed to what at this point is still a very reasonable contract for next year. If he doesn't kind of take a step forward in terms of his performance, it is a contract that not going to become crippling, but could become a contract that's not great. So I think we certainly think about Uresti as our right fielder for this upcoming season. But given that we have a lot of really interesting young outfielders on the way in our organization, he may not be with us for the long term, even though we have signed him to a long-term contract. And last, but certainly not least, is the franchise Jake Ortega. As we talked about, we've already exercised his team option for $8 million next year. The year after that will be the final option we have on the deal that we signed him to 7 years ago at this point, when he had really proven nothing at all in the majors. And that contract has worked out incredibly well for us. Ortega was the MVP this year of both the ALDS and the ALCS. He is now a 2-time World Series champion. Taking a look at his season, it was a great bounce-back year for him after a broken kneecap fractured his 2037 season. 312 batting average, 41 doubles, 9 triples, 22 homers, scored 116 runs, drove in 89, led the American League for the first time with 46 stolen bases. 153 WRC plus is even a bit better than his career rate, and his 9 WAR marked the second time that he has led the American League in WAR. The first time he did that back in 2034 was when he was named American League MVP. Certainly think he's going to be a strong candidate for that this year. Mentioned fielding-wise, he still is an outstanding center fielder. 9 zone rating, 1.036 defensive efficiency, and 3.22 range factor. So he's tracking down a lot of balls out there. He actually had a 1,000 fielding percentage in center field this year in the 104 games that he started out there. But I did mention that to limit the wear and tear a bit on the fragile Ortega, who's now in his 30s, we did play Palomares in center field against left-handed pitching, moved Ortega over to right field, And he made both of the errors that he made this year in his 47 games in right field, which is a little weird. Still strong in terms of his zone rating and excellent in terms of his defensive efficiency out there, but would expect that he will continue to play center field for us more days than not going forward. And I mentioned that I think that Mr. Ortega may have a chance at winning his second MVP award when we get into the voting in a few weeks after leading the American League with that 9-batter war this year. I think his top two contenders against him for the MVP award are the guys who finished second and third in the batter war voting. And it's going to be interesting because Ortega brings more to the table defensively than either of those guys, which we can see in the fact that his WAR was higher than either of theirs. But both of those other candidates kind of led the league in more categories and led the league in the categories that historically over the course of baseball history have tended to result in MVP awards. So it'll be interesting if leading the league in WAR and stolen bases results in an MVP award for Jake Ortega, or they perhaps go a different path. Galterio Mancina of the AL Central winning Kansas City Royals is another strong candidate. He tied for the league lead with our buddy Mr. Landin with 188 hits, but Mancina also won the batting title, led the league in on-base percentage, led the league in slugging percentage, led the league in OPS, and led the league in WRC+, while putting up that 7 WAR for a playoff team. Mancina was an MVP in 2032, so he's been waiting even longer than Ortega for his potential second MVP award. And the other real strong candidate is Juan Molina of the Rangers. We beat them by 8 games in the division, but they are a perennial playoff team, and they were this year. Molina, a right fielder, and 7.7 WAR, but he led the league in both home runs and ribbies with 46 and 131 respectively. Also scored over 100 runs, put up a 148 WRC+. Molina, as a right fielder, is an outstanding defensive right fielder. As you can see, 17.9 zone rating and defensive efficiency over 1100. That being said, I still think what we get out of center field in Ortega is more valuable. Mancina defensively is a first baseman, and he is nothing special, a below average defensive first baseman. So I think it's going to be a real interesting call. I don't think that just simply having the highest batter WAR guarantees Ortega is going to win the MVP, because as we talked about, 2 real good candidates from playoff teams. Molina led the league in homers and ribbies, and then Mancina led the league in hits, batting average, OPS, OPS plus, WRC plus, a lot of the ratio categories as opposed to the counting categories where Mancina was particularly strong this year. So next time around, before we start moving the season forward, we will check in on our very highly regarded farm system. We'll check in on some of our former players and some of the top prospects in baseball, see what they've done over the past year. If you've got any initial thoughts on what you might do in this upcoming offseason, always helpful for me to hear them. Until our next episode, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.